You're under my protection.
She fled in the powerful Duke's carriage to escape a forced marriage. He swore to protect her. Arabella Voss Ashford threw herself into the Duke of Ravenswood's carriage to escape a forced marriage. As the man hunting her peered through the glass with a lantern, Lucian Blackthorn pulled her close and whispered, "You're under my protection." But Arabella didn't know the man sitting in the shadowed corner of that black carriage was the notorious Duke whose name mothers used to frighten children into obedience, the one all of London whispered about in fear and disgust. She only knew that Cedric Vale, the man she was being sold to in marriage, intended to own her completely, body and soul, to settle her family's crushing debts. The ivory lace of her wedding gown was still damp with tears. She'd run 4 blocks through London streets in satin slippers before diving into a carriage bearing a crest that made grown men avert their eyes and cross to the opposite side of the street. She collapsed onto the plush crimson velvet of the seat, her entire body trembling. That's when she smelled expensive tobacco mingled with the scent of rain-soaked leather, rich and distinctly masculine and dangerous. She wasn't alone. She looked up slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Sharp, aristocratic features marked by deliberate scars that carved across his left cheekbone. His eyes cold, assessing, containing the kind of stillness that comes before violence. He watched her the way a wolf assesses prey that has wandered into its territory. Then a shadow fell across the carriage window, blocking the gaslight from the street. Cedric Vale's face pressed against the glass, his expression twisted between confusion and rage, a lantern raised in his hand. He was hunting. He started tapping on the window slow, deliberate, the sound of a man accustomed to obedience. "Arabella, darling," his muffled voice came through the glass. "Step out now, and I'll be merciful." She whimpered, pressing herself back against the velvet, waiting for the Duke to throw her out, waiting for her own escape to collapse into recapture. Instead, Lucian leaned forward, his gloved hand resting with absolute certainty on her trembling shoulder. "He will not touch you," he whispered, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. "I give you my word." He tapped the roof twice with deliberate precision. The carriage lurched forward, gathering speed, gliding past a furious Cedric Vale who stood abandoned on the street, his lantern swinging uselessly in the darkness. But as they drove through the night toward the looming silhouette of Ravenswood Estate, Arabella couldn't shake one consuming question that gnawed at her mind. Why had his carriage been parked so conveniently near the church? Of all the streets in London, of all the possible locations where a carriage might wait, why there? Was this rescue, or was this something far more calculated? The question that will haunt you: was the Duke's carriage there by accident or by design? Because the answer to that one question changes everything. It changes whether you see Lucian as savior or schemer. It changes whether Arabella is lucky or whether she walked straight into something far more calculated than a forced marriage. And here's what I know: most of you will guess wrong. In the comments right now, I want you to answer, why do you think his carriage was parked at that church? Don't think too hard. Go with your gut, your first instinct. Because later in this story, there's a reveal that will make you question your own judgment. And I need you to have already committed to an answer, because that's when the real mind-bending happens. Like this video, if you love unreliable perspectives, if you like wondering whether the person you're rooting for is actually the villain. Subscribe right now because this story has 3 major twists, and the first one happens before you expect it. I won't spoil it, but it completely reframes the protection scene you just watched. Share this with someone who loves mysteries, someone who loves trying to solve puzzles, someone who loves the moment when the narrative suddenly shifts and they realize they've been reading the story wrong the entire time. Because by the end of this, you won't just have watched a love story, you'll have been played. And honestly, you're going to love it. The morning of Arabella's wedding began not with joy, but with the sound of her mother's weeping echoing through the hallway of Ashford House. It wasn't the gentle, happy tears of a mother watching her daughter begin a new chapter. It was something far more terrible. The broken, guilty, wrenching sobs of a woman who had sold her own child to purchase her family's continued existence. The Ashford estate had been crumbling for years, bleeding money with each passing season. Her father's gambling addiction had drained the family coffers. Her brother's failed business ventures had compounded the losses. The mortgage payments they could no longer meet seemed to multiply with each quarter. And then Cedric Vale had appeared, like a vulture circling carrion, like a predator recognizing vulnerable prey, offering to clear every single debt, every obligation, every financial devastation in exchange for one thing: Arabella. She had met him only twice before the marriage was arranged, and both encounters had been enough to recognize the danger beneath his refined exterior. The first time, he had looked at her the way wealthy men looked at horses at auction, assessing her teeth, her posture, her apparent capability to bear children, her value as breeding stock. His gaze had been dispassionate, calculating, stripping away any semblance of her humanity and replacing it with numbers, with utility, with the price tag of ownership. The second time, he had cornered her in the library, his hand finding her throat with casual certainty, not squeezing, not yet, just resting there as a reminder of what submission would look like. "You'll learn quickly," he had whispered against her ear, his breath reeking of brandy and entitlement. "Obedient wives live comfortable lives. Disobedient ones learn to fear the dark." Now, as Constance fastened the final buttons of the ivory gown with shaking hands, as the lace was arranged and rearranged, as the veil was positioned like a shroud over Arabella's face, the truth pressed down on her like the weight of the dress itself. Her mother couldn't meet her eyes in the mirror. Her father had already left for the church to fortify himself with drink, unable to face the moment when he would hand over his daughter to a predator. Theodore, her brother, had made one final desperate attempt to convince their father to call off the arrangement. Arabella had heard the argument through the walls, heard Theodore's voice break with frustration and failure when he realized no argument, no logic, no appeal to morality would change their father's decision. The mathematics of poverty were merciless. Either Arabella married Cedric Vale, or the entire family faced ruin. As Arabella was escorted toward the church with footmen flanking her, not as protection, but as guards, their hands ready to physically return her if she wavered, if she broke, if she tried to run, she understood something with startling clarity. No one was coming to save her. Her family had made their choice. The law supported Cedric Vale's claim. Society expected her compliance. The church would sanctify this transaction as though it were blessed by God himself. Salvation, if it existed at all, would have to come from within. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford House, illuminating a table set for breakfast that no one wanted to eat. Lord Henry sat at the head with a tumbler of brandy already half empty, his hands shaking as he lifted it to his lips. The amber liquid caught the light, the only thing in the room that seemed to glow with any warmth. Constance moved through the motions of normalcy, spreading butter on toast she wouldn't eat, wearing a dress 2 seasons out of fashion with the grace of a woman who had forgotten how to feel shame. Theodore sat rigid across from his father, his jaw so tightly clenched she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. "We have debts exceeding 40,000 pounds, Henry said to the wall, not to his son. Vale clears them all of it, in exchange for a marriage. Without this, we lose the house, Theodore. We lose everything." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Arabella, listening from the hallway where she'd positioned herself after overhearing the argument that had woken her before dawn, felt something inside her crystallize. This was the moment she understood what everyone around her had already accepted. No one was coming to save her because everyone was drowning. Theodore's voice cracked. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Henry said, and the finality of it was worse than any shout. When Sophie came to dress her an hour later, the wedding gown was as beautiful as it was suffocating. Each button the maid fastened felt like another seal on a tomb. Constance stood in the doorway, watching with eyes that had given up fighting. "You look beautiful, darling," she whispered, unable to meet Arabella's reflection in the mirror. The lie settled between them like a corpse. The walk to church was the longest journey of her life. Theodore insisted on accompanying her, his hand eventually finding hers. She understood his silence. It was an apology for his failure, for everyone's failure. The London streets that had once promised adventure now twisted into a maze, designed specifically to trap her. Every corner led to the altar. Every street narrowed her choices further. Then the overturned apple cart. A vendor's cart spilled its cargo across the cobblestones, and for 3 seconds, an eternity and nothing at all, the footman's attention fractured. Theodore squeezed her hand once, a final wordless goodbye. She saw the gap between them, small and terrifying and absolutely necessary. Arabella ran. The wedding gown tangled around her legs. Her satin slippers slipped on wet stones. Behind her, shouts echoed, but she didn't turn to hear them. Ahead, a black carriage bearing a silver wolf crowned with thorns stood waiting in the shadow of the church's stone walls. She didn't know who owned it. She didn't care. She threw herself inside, and finally, for the first time that morning, she breathed. If you just felt your stomach drop when you realized Arabella's own family chose financial survival over her safety, you're not alone, and that's exactly why you need to see what happens next. Right now, millions of people are watching their loved ones make choices that prioritize money over humanity. Millions are facing situations where protection costs everything. This story is about what happens when a woman stops waiting for rescue from the people who owe her protection and starts demanding it from the most unexpected place. Comment below. Have you ever realized that no one is coming to save you? What did you do? Your story matters. The people reading these comments need to know they're not the only ones who face that moment of terrifying clarity. Like if you believe a woman's agency matters more than her family's comfort. Subscribe if you need to see Arabella not just survive, but absolutely dominate. And because the woman you're about to meet isn't asking for permission anymore. And share this with someone who needs to hear that escape is possible, even when it looks like walking toward danger. She collapsed onto the velvet floor of the carriage, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her wedding gown spreading around her like a white stain on crimson. The scent hit her first. Expensive tobacco and rain-soaked leather, rich and distinctly male and terrifying. Then she realized she wasn't alone. Her eyes snapped upward, and she found herself staring into the face of Lucian Blackthorn, Duke of Ravenswood. Sharp, aristocratic features marked by deliberate scars that cut across his left cheekbone like a map of violence. His eyes were cold, assessing her with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. "Nah, you're bleeding on my upholstery," he said, and his tone held neither cruelty nor kindness. It simply stated fact, the way one might observe that it was raining. A shadow fell across the carriage window. Cedric Vale's face pressed against the glass, his expression cycling from confusion to rage. "Arabella, come out now. This is a misunderstanding." But Lucian's voice cut through the glass like a blade. "She's under my protection. You'll withdraw." The way he said it, absolute final, made clear this wasn't negotiation. It was decree. The carriage lurched forward, gathering speed, and Arabella understood something that made her stomach twist. This man could be worse than Vale. He could be using her. He could have motives that remained hidden in the shadows where he seemed to exist. But he was all she had, And that realization was its own kind of trap. Through the window, London blurred into streaks of gaslight and darkness. They drove toward the outskirts of the city, toward a place that existed on the edges of respectable society. Then Ravenswood rose before them, all dark stone and Gothic arches, surrounded by carefully maintained grounds that suggested money and mystery in equal measure. It was beautiful and terrifying, a mirror of the man beside her. Mrs. Stone met them at the door, a woman with kind eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen desperate women arrive in wedding gowns before. "Come, Miss Ashford, let's get you warm and safe," she said, and her gentleness was almost shocking in its sincerity. Later, alone in a guest room, still wearing her blood-stained wedding gown, Arabella stared at her reflection. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, her eyes wide with the shock of survival. She whispered to the woman in the mirror, "What have you done?" She didn't have an answer. She removed the gown carefully, slipped into the soft bed that Mrs. Stone had prepared, and lay in the darkness listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Ravenswood settling around her. The wind in the eaves, the distant creak of old wood, the weight of not knowing whether she'd found safety or simply traded one gilded cage for another, darker version. Sleep didn't come, only questions. She's about to make a choice that will define everything. Trust a man London fears, or stay with the man who owns her. There is no middle ground here. There is no safe option. The only question is which risk she's willing to take. Before you watch what happens next, now tell me in the comments, if you were Arabella in this exact moment, carriage moving, hunter outside, stranger beside you in the dark, would you trust the Duke or would you run? There's no wrong answer, but your answer reveals something about how you navigate power, fear, and survival. Like if you'd take Lucian's hand. Comment if you'd run. Subscribe if you need to see whether her choice was the bravest or the most reckless thing she could have done. Because here's the thing, the story doesn't end with escape. It ends with discovery. And by the time you know the truth about why his carriage was there, you'll have completely reassessed everything you think about protection, danger, and this Duke. Share this with someone who loves a love story built on ambiguity and genuine risk. The kind where neither person is entirely good, and that's precisely what makes it real. The first week at Ravenswood, Arabella waited for the price to be named. It never came. Mrs. Stone brought tea without asking if she wanted it, and when Arabella drank it, the older woman didn't interpret gratitude into the gesture. She simply refilled the cup. James Whitmore, the stable master, spoke to her about the horses as if her observations mattered, asking her opinion on their temperaments, listening to her answers with genuine attention. Victor Ashbrook maintained such meticulous professionalism that it became its own form of kindness, a structure of respect that required nothing from her except her presence. No one asked her to perform gratitude. No one treated her as a burden. No one whispered about the runaway bride in the wedding gown covered in blood. Lucian remained distant. He provided rooms, clothes, freedom to move through the estate's sprawling halls and gardens. But he didn't seek her out. When they passed in corridors or encountered each other in shared spaces, he was polite, guarded, a man conducting business with a woman who existed in his home but not quite in his life. Arabella found herself waiting for the catch, the moment he would reveal his true motivation, the cost of his protection. It never materialized. One evening, she found him in the library, surrounded by books and candlelight, and her patience fractured. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. He looked up from his reading, and for a moment something unguarded flickered across his scarred face. "Nothing," he said. "You're safe here. That's the only requirement." When she pressed, unable to accept such simplicity, no one is kind without reason, he regarded her with an expression that might have been pity. "I am," he said quietly, and returned to his book. Days became weeks. No one mentioned the wedding, Cedric Vale, or her family. Ravenswood stopped feeling like a fortress designed to contain her and became simply a place she inhabited. The corners that had seemed threatening grew familiar. The Gothic shadows that had terrified her became comforting, a shelter rather than a cage. She began to believe, tentatively, that safety might be real. Then Lucian came to her with a legal document. "For your protection," he explained, "I'm proposing we formalize our arrangement. A marriage in legal terms only. It makes you the Duchess, which grants you certain protections under law. Vale cannot touch you while you carry my name." She agreed not because she trusted him completely, but because the alternative was remaining eternally vulnerable, always running, always afraid. The ceremony was quiet, only the staff as witnesses. Arabella stood in a simple dress, not white, not a bride, simply a woman signing documents that changed her legal existence. When it was finished, she returned to what was now her wife's room, lay on her marriage bed that contained no marriage, and allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in years. She allowed herself to hope. The writing lessons began on a gray morning when James Whitmore appeared at her door with riding clothes and an offer rather than a command. As they moved through the stables toward a chestnut mare with intelligent eyes, Lucian emerged from the shadows of the barn. "A woman who can control a horse controls something alive and powerful," he said, watching her settle into the saddle with uncertain hands. "Society will remember that. Not the gown, not the title, the way she commands." Arabella understood then that this wasn't about horsemanship. It was about discovering what her body could accomplish. The armory came next. Lucian moved through it with the ease of a man familiar with violence, selecting weapons with deliberate care. He placed a knife in her palm, lightweight, balanced, deadly. "You're not learning violence," he told her, positioning her fingers on the grip. "You're learning that you're not helpless." A pistol followed, then a sword. Each lesson made her hands steadier, made her understand that capability wasn't inherited or granted. It was built, one movement at a time. In the study, they played chess while he explained the architecture of power, how financial networks created obligation, how social hierarchies depended on compliance, how powerful men built empires on the desperation of others. He showed her Cedric Vale's ledgers, evidence he'd gathered over years, mapping the pathways of exploitation. "Weakness always leaves traces," Lucian said, moving pieces across the board with precision. "You simply have to know where to look." During these lessons, something shifted between them. Lucian spoke more freely, letting her glimpse the man beneath the legend. When she asked about his scars, he didn't deflect. "Because if I wear my darkness openly, no one can use it against me," he explained, tracing the line of scarred tissue with a detached expression. "No one can threaten to expose the real me, because I'm not hiding." She understood then that his scars weren't punishment. They were rebellion. Week by week, Arabella felt the transformation in her own body. Her spine straightened. The tremor left her hands. She stopped flinching at unexpected sounds. The woman in the mirror began to look like someone capable of choosing her own fate rather than accepting what others decided for her. One evening, after Lucian had shown her another layer of Vale's predatory network, something crystallized in her mind. "I want to know everything about him," she said quietly. "I want to understand how to expose him." Lucian looked up from his documents, and she saw recognition flicker across his face. She wasn't asking for protection anymore. She was asking for knowledge. She was no longer a woman needing rescue. She was becoming dangerous in an entirely different way. Later, in the armory, practicing sword work in the lamplight, Arabella felt her body move with increasing certainty. Each strike grew stronger, each parry more instinctive. She understood finally what Lucian had been teaching her all along. She was becoming someone who could never be forced to an altar again. The study became their war room. Lucian laid out years of investigation with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Financial documents showing how Cedric Vale had systematically destroyed families through debt, testimonies from women whose names appeared in his correspondence like inventory lists, a timeline of predatory patterns that stretched back further than Arabella had imagined possible. Without a woman willing to testify publicly, Lucian said, his voice careful and measured, willing to face his lawyers and society's judgment, I can only prove financial manipulation. I need someone to name what he is. The question hung between them, unspoken but present. Did he need her as a strategic asset, or did he care whether she survived? Arabella met the other women on a gray afternoon. Margaret, now Lady Margaret Winters, carried her trauma with rigid dignity. Elizabeth sat withdrawn in a parlor, her eyes haunted by losses Arabella didn't ask about. Catherine had hardened into something sharp and dangerous, a woman transformed by survival into something society couldn't touch anymore. Their stories were different in details, different promises, different manipulations, different endings, but identical in essence. A man who had looked at them as property, a man who had used his wealth and position to own them completely, a man who had discarded them when they ceased to serve his purposes. That night, returning to the study, Arabella understood something with absolute clarity. If I can stop him, she said quietly, I want to. Not because you've asked, because other girls will face what I faced if someone doesn't. Over the following weeks, they worked in careful proximity, gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, building a narrative that would withstand scrutiny. As they moved through the evidence together, something shifted in how Lucian looked at her. He no longer saw a strategic asset. He saw a woman of remarkable courage, someone willing to face her own trauma to protect others. And Arabella, watching him work, understood that his years of investigation hadn't been cold revenge. They were the expression of a man who had spent his life understanding what happened when powerful men weren't stopped. One night, reviewing documents by candlelight, their hands brushed across the same page. Lucian pulled back as if burned. I'm sorry, I shouldn't. But Arabella reached for his hand deliberately, held it steady in her own. Why not? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his palm upward, intertwining his fingers with hers. In that gesture was an admission that strategy and feeling weren't mutually exclusive, that you could want something for multiple reasons, and all of them could be true. That a man investigating a criminal could also be falling in love with a woman brave enough to face him. In the candlelit study, surrounded by evidence and possibility, they understood simultaneously that they were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were building something together. She found him in the study at dusk, but for once he wasn't surrounded by documents or reviewing strategy. He sat motionless in candlelight, staring at a portrait on the wall, a woman's face, elegant and kind, painted decades before in a moment when she still believed her son would become the good man she raised him to be. My mother, Lucian said without turning. She died thinking I would become good. Instead, I became powerful and dark. Arabella didn't offer comfort in platitudes. She sat beside him and told him what she understood with absolute certainty. You became powerful and dark because that's what the world required to protect the people you loved. But I don't think you have to stay that way. I think you chose that once, and you can choose differently now. When he turned to her, his expression was stripped of all pretense. I can't separate what I feel for you from the investigation, from the strategy, from the need for justice. I've tried, But somewhere between showing you evidence of his crimes and watching you become who you are now, my motivations became impossible to untangle. I don't know if I feel this way because I need your testimony, or if I'm helping with the investigation because I love you." She reached for his face, traced the line of his scars with her fingertips. "Does it matter?" she asked quietly. "You've been honest with me about everything. You've never forced me to participate. You've given me choice at every moment, whatever your original motivation. What you've shown me is that I matter to you, not as a tool, but as a person. That's enough." They kissed then, not the tender first kiss of romance novels, but something desperate and real, months of unspoken need compressed into a single moment. The intensity of two people who had learned to trust in conditions that made trust nearly impossible. When they finally pulled apart, breathing hard, they were different people. They talked through the night, about his scars and why he chose them, about her family and what forgiveness might look like, about his fears that he was too damaged to love anyone, about her fears that she was incapable of believing in safety. They made no grand promises. They made no detailed plans. They only promised honesty and agreed to move forward together, moment by moment. As dawn broke over Ravenswood, in painting the study in shades of amber and gold, Arabella lay against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, both of them finally at peace. Not because everything was resolved or simple, but because they understood that love didn't require certainty. It required only the willingness to choose each other again and again and again. Alexander Reed delivered the warning with the precision of a man who had spent weeks tracking Cedric Vale's increasingly desperate movements. "He's meeting with hired men. Money is changing hands. Something is being planned," he reported to Lucian in the study, while Arabella listened from the doorway. They had known intellectually that this moment would come, but knowing and facing were entirely different things. Lucian tightened security at Ravenswood, but they both understood the unspoken truth. They couldn't hide forever. Eventually, they would have to emerge. Eventually, they would have to face him. The summer ball was everything a London society event should be. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across silk gowns, orchestras filling the air with classical music, the most influential families and government officials gathered in one magnificent space. Colonel Hardwicke and Sir William Ashby positioned themselves strategically with palace guards. Lady Catherine Ashworth sat with Arabella, her presence a statement of solidarity. The evidence was prepared, documented, ready to be presented with all of London as witness. Lucian took the floor to speak. The room quieted. Arabella stood to present the testimonies of Margaret, Elizabeth, and Catherine, 3 women whose lives had been systematically destroyed by a man everyone in this room had considered respectable. The evidence was irrefutable. The pattern was undeniable. Cedric Vale's empire was collapsing in real time, watched by everyone who mattered. That's when the fire started. A deliberate blaze in the East Wing, smoke billowing through hallways, chaos spreading like an infection. Hired men moved through the confusion with terrible purpose. In the pandemonium, hands grabbed Arabella from behind, strong hands, belonging to a man whose face she recognized from her wedding day. She fought, biting his arm, driving her heel into his instep, but he was stronger, more determined, dragging her toward a side exit where a carriage waited with its door open like a mouth ready to swallow her. Lucian's scream cut through the chaos when he realized she was gone. Not a sound of pain, but something far more terrifying, the sound of a man's control shattering. He moved through the burning ballroom like a force of nature, no longer strategic or calculated. He was transformed into something primal, something dangerous, something willing to burn the entire world down if it meant finding her. The carriage lurched forward, moving rapidly through London's streets. Arabella, pressed against the leather seat, understood with absolute clarity that this was the confrontation she'd been dreading. The moment when escape became impossible, when hiding ended, when she finally had to face what she'd been running toward all along. Lucian was coming. She knew he was coming, but so was everything she'd been terrified of. The room had one door and two guards. Arabella understood immediately what Vale intended: to drag her across the Scottish border where marriages could be forced, where her screams would echo into nothingness, where she would cease to exist as anything except his property. The guards were confident, bored even, believing a woman in a torn ball gown posed no threat. That was their weakness. She watched them for hours. One guard shifted his weight every 7 minutes, favoring his left side. The other yawned every quarter hour, eyes unfocused. The heavy candlestick sat on the mantel, elegant and lethal. When the first guard's attention drifted toward the window, she moved. The candlestick connected with the back of his skull with a sound like thunder. His body crumpled. The second guard lunged, but her scream fractured his concentration, a primal sound that belonged to something wild and desperate, and she was past him, through the door, running. The building was a maze, but she didn't need to understand it. She needed only to move away from pursuit, down stairs that spiraled endlessly, through hallways that seemed to multiply. Behind her, boots thundered and voices shouted her name like a curse. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Stopping meant capture. Stopping meant the end. The study was the last room before the hallway narrowed into nothing. She locked the door and heard immediately the explosion of sound as they threw themselves against the wood. The window was her only option, 3 stories above ground, with a narrow ledge running along the exterior wall toward a distant balcony. Madness, to choose that over staying. But madness was survival. The ledge was barely wide enough for her feet. Wind clawed at her dress, trying to pull her toward the drop. She pressed her back against the stone wall an inch sideways, her focus narrowing to the balcony ahead. Not down, never down, only forward. Her fingernails broke against a rough stone. Her dress tangled around her legs. Pain became irrelevant. Then her foot slipped. For one terrible second, gravity won. She was falling, and then her hands, moving on pure instinct, found purchase on the stone. Nails breaking, skin tearing, but she held. She pulled herself back onto the ledge, gasping, and kept moving. Behind her, the guards appeared at the window, shouting, but they didn't follow. They knew the ledge was too narrow, too dangerous, too unforgiving. She reached the balcony and hauled herself over, just as fingers grasped at her dress from inside. The fabric tore completely, but she was through, safe, alive. The balcony doors opened and Lucian emerged, his face a map of terror that dissolved into relief the moment he saw her. She collapsed into his arms, shaking uncontrollably. "I got out," she whispered against his chest. "I did it myself." He held her as if he would never let her go, understanding in that moment that she had become something unreachable now. She had saved herself, and Vale's desperation had finally, irrevocably, crossed into territory no amount of money could buy him out of. Cedric Vale's arrest made headlines that dominated London society for weeks. His hired men were captured. The evidence was presented publicly with all the weight of undeniable truth. A society fractured around him. Some men defended him out of loyalty or shared guilt, but most distanced themselves with the speed of rats abandoning a sinking ship. Legal proceedings began. Newspapers carried the story of the predatory businessman and the brave woman who had the courage to expose him. By autumn, he was convicted. By winter, he was imprisoned. Arabella's family faced their own reckoning. Lord Henry sank deeper into despair, understanding finally the cost of his choices. Constance grieved not just the loss of the Vale fortune she'd briefly believed would save them, but the knowledge of what she'd been willing to sacrifice. When Theodore appeared at Ravenswood, asking for forgiveness for his failure to protect her, Arabella held him while he wept. "I forgive you," she told him quietly. "But I don't forgive the system that made us all complicit in what almost happened to me." He left understanding that some wounds heal, but they leave scars that shouldn't be forgotten. Ravenswood became a sanctuary. The danger had passed. The investigation was concluded. Arabella and Lucian moved through the estate as simply two people who had chosen each other, no longer bound by necessity or strategy, only by genuine connection and the decision, made daily, to continue forward together. One evening, Lucian brought her to his study. On the desk rested a ring, his signet ring, heavy gold set with a dark ruby, engraved with the Ravenswood crest. "This ring is traditionally given to the woman who becomes Duchess in truth, not merely in law," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I'm not asking you to marry me because you need protection. I'm asking you to choose this, knowing exactly who I am and what our beginning cost us." She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I choose you," she said. "Not as escape, not as survival, but because you make me want to be brave. Because you see me as someone worthy of choice, and I want to spend my life becoming the woman you believe I am." They kissed as equals, as partners, as survivors. Over the following weeks, Arabella claimed her role as Duchess not through inheritance, but through intention. She and Lucian established Ravenswood as refuge for women fleeing predatory circumstances. They funded investigations into corruption and abuse. They wielded power with consciousness of its cost and responsibility. In the library where she'd first found him vulnerable, Arabella stood looking at her ring, at the ruby catching afternoon light, at the crest engraved in gold. She looked at the books surrounding her, at Lucian reading across the room, at the life they were building together. She had run from one life into another, but this time she ran towards something instead of away from it. That choice, made freely and renewed daily, made all the difference. You just watched a woman transform, from someone running for her life to someone choosing it, from someone afraid of her own shadow to someone wielding power consciously, from someone needing rescue to someone rescuing herself. And in watching her transformation, maybe you recognized something in yourself. Maybe you saw your own moment of desperation, or your own moment of realizing no one was coming to save you, your own moment of deciding you had to save yourself. If that's you, I want you to know, you're not alone. The comments below are going to be filled with people whose lives were changed by Arabella's story because it was also their story. Women who ran, women who fought back, women who chose themselves. Comment your moment, not the details if they're too painful, just the realization, just the choice, just the moment when you became unstoppable. Like if you understand that love is a choice, like if you believe you're worthy of being chosen, like if you know that the bravest thing you ever did was choose yourself first. Share this story with the woman in your life who's standing on her own ledge right now, the one who's wondering if it's safe to jump, the one who's doubting whether she's strong enough, the one who's waiting for permission to run. Send her Arabella's story. Send her the proof that survival is possible. Subscribe because your story matters too. Your transformation, your journey, your moment of becoming unstoppable, and the next chapter of your life, the one where you choose what happens next. That's the story we want to follow. But more than that, subscribe for the stories coming next. Stories like Arabella's, stories of women learning their own power, stories of men discovering their capacity for redemption, stories of impossible choices, genuine love, and the moments when ordinary people become extraordinary. There's a woman out there right now, scared, trapped, wondering if she has the courage to run. Her story is coming. And there's a man learning that darkness doesn't have to be permanent. His story is coming. There are secrets waiting to be uncovered, betrayals waiting to be exposed, moments of transformation waiting to be witnessed, and you don't want to miss a single one. Subscribe right now so when the next story drops, when the next Arabella makes her choice, when the next Lucian discovers redemption is possible, when the next impossible love unfolds, you're there from the very first moment. You're part of the journey from the beginning. This journey doesn't end here. It continues in the comments, in the shares, in the women who recognize themselves in Arabella's choices, and in the next story, and the next, and the next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing. Thank you for choosing yourself. Now subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the best stories, the ones that change how you see yourself, the ones that stay with you long after they end, those are the ones you discover from the very beginning. Welcome home, and welcome to what comes next. Don't miss it. Subscribe now.